Oregon will win a national title with Dan Lanning. It's really just a matter of when. This year obviously it was Ohio State's time with Ryan Day. He was there, since 2019, and it just got to a point where Ohio State was obviously the most talented team in the country. But here comes Oregon now. I mean, 2024 season they reached some record highs in terms of Oregon football that they haven't reached before. We can talk about their longest stretch on top of the polls. We can talk about them winning their first Big Ten national title. We can talk about them reaching the college football playoff and beating Penn State and whatnot too. So you sit there and you say to yourself, they have so many moving pieces. They consistently recruit within the top 5 in the country. Transfer portal is always pretty solid, all things considered. They have a number of different offensive weapons coming in. You have Dante Moore coming in from UCLA. You got Kenyon Sadiq, who's a really good tight end, and then you got wideouts Justice Lowe and Jeremiah McLennan, who are going to be replacing Tez Johnson on the outside. So, I mean, the one thing you always have going for you with Oregon too is it's a special place to play and recruit at. Because I sit there, think about the trajectory of Oregon football in general, and you go back to the 2011s, 2012s, and you think of the Chip Kelly era, and then you move forward with Mark Hedslick, and then you have that awful season with Willie Taggart, and then Mario Cristobal. Once when he had that era in Oregon for a couple seasons, to me that's where the program really turned from a middle of the road kind of program to that upper echelon, a legit elite program. I think that's where the tide started turning in terms of really kind of solidifying themselves as being a really respectable program, particularly in terms of recruiting rankings and whatnot too. And obviously it made a big difference too once when Dan Lanning came. But if you look at the trajectory of their recruiting rankings, it's sort of an up and down, especially in that middle part where Hedslick is finishing his last 2 seasons or so, and then Willie Taggart had that one lone season when they realized like, hey, this guy's not it, kind of thing. But now we're sitting there with Oregon, and the one thing, even when I go back and think about Oregon last year, is for the most part there weren't many glaring weaknesses with this program. Like I couldn't sit down and say to myself, okay, this is how I would attack Oregon. This is how I would exploit Oregon. This is what's missing from Oregon, because you had Dylan Gabriel, who I would argue is one of the, probably at least statistically speaking, one of the best college quarterbacks of all time. You had a number of really solid receivers. You had Jahir Muhammad at cornerback, and a number of other dudes who I think are to go in the NFL. And you sit there also, and you have a really strong front seven too, with Mateo Ukulele coming back to, who led the team with 10.5 sacks last year too. And you have Devin Jackson, who should be returning as well. So you do find a little bit of a balance between, there's always going to be some guys who cash. When I mean cash in, they could be cashing in the NFL. They could be cashing in and going to another Power 4 program. So it really just kind of depends. But overall, I mean, you have to ask yourself, hey, Oregon is in a really strong spot here. And especially when you look at their schedule going into this season compared to a couple years past, I don't know how you don't see yourself being really confident and optimistic about this team. And especially you're at the point where, Oregon should be in the point where we're talking about national titles every year. We're talking about them, making a move on Penn State and making a move on Ohio State. And right now they're definitely ahead of Michigan. So, I mean, when I sit down and look at the schedule, I say to myself, okay, you start off, you have a couple what I call tune-up games. I mean, Montana State, one of the top teams in the FCS, who announced that they're going to be moving to the Mountain West a couple days ago. So I think that could be an intriguing matchup. But again, it's the Oregon Ducks. They're going to kick ass and take names. Then you go down to Stillwater, and you have Oklahoma State. And I'll probably do a video on Oklahoma State before the season starts too. I think they will get better, but again, that's Oregon. That's just not a game that they should be losing. then your first real Big Ten game is you're on the road. You're on the road versus Northwestern, and they're still kind of figuring themselves out too. I do think they really made a very good hire with Ryan Braun. I think he is the real deal, and kind of being able to turn the ship in the right direction, especially with trying to move on from Pat Fitzgerald and trying to resolve all the bullying lawsuits that are kind of the bullying, hazing kind of thing that are stemming from that. So it looks like they're resolving that and moving things in the right direction too. But when I look at the schedule, I mean, for the most part too, I think you should expect a 10-11, possibly an undefeated season. Because really your biggest test is going to be September 27th when you go to Happy Valley and play Penn State. And granted, it's going to depend on how Oregon looks. I think Dante Moore is the real deal, and I think UCLA tried really hard to keep him. But I think when he sat there and said to himself, "Hey, the Oregon starting quarterback job is going to be open," UCLA is still kind of figuring things out. I think Deshaun Foster could be the guy to kind of piece it all together. I do think there are some serious question marks in terms of UCLA and how much they commit to their football program. However, Oregon right now is just in a win now sort of mood, and it just seems like a great fit too, especially with the number of receivers that they've brought in, and also the returning production that you have all together too. Really kind of seems to gel all together. But if you ask me in terms of what exactly needs to happen for Dan Lanning to win a national title, I'd say it's a couple things. I mean, outside of the team itself, one of the big questions I would ask myself is how much improvement is Michigan going to have on the offensive side of the ball? I think it could be a big question. I would say with Penn State, another question you're going to ask is, yes, there's a lot of hype surrounding Andy Kalinnicki and everything like that too. But at the same time, have teams started to figure him out? Because it seems like when Penn State plays a team like an Ohio State, like a Michigan, like an Oregon, who has an elite defense, they either can't win a shootout or they can't move the ball at all. And that continues to kind of be a problem for them. And if you're Oregon too, and you can exploit that, that definitely seems like something that you can definitely build on compared to 2024 and continue to be on top of the AP polls, definitely contending for another Big Ten title too. And, for the most part, I will say the one thing about Oregon is that they've definitely built a type of program where the model is relatively consistent and you don't really see too many dips in terms of their program. And Dan Lanning, I mean, he has that defensive background from Georgia. He's learned from some of the greatest coaches ever in college football, from Nick Saban, from Kirby Smart. So, I mean, he has this vision, he has this passion too, and especially too when he decided not to take the Alabama job. What my immediate thought is, as somebody who's covered Penn State for a number of years, I say to myself, man, he's committed to Eugene, Oregon, and I don't think he'll leave Eugene, Oregon until he wins the national championship, which I'll say in the show right now, he's going to. It's just a matter of when. And when I look down and look at the rest of the schedule, a lot of these games are really games that they should be taken care of, because I say to myself too, I mean, granted, you're going to have a tough game versus the Wisconsins of the world that you're going to be home at. And obviously being on the road versus Iowa is always tough. So there could be a game or two, maybe outside of Penn State, where they could lose. They could lose. But at the same time, you do avoid Ohio State. You do avoid Michigan State. You do avoid, you do play USC at the end. So, I mean, it's definitely a schedule that they can navigate. However, there are a couple of games on the schedule where I would sit there and say to myself, hey, if they don't take that game seriously enough, they could definitely get upsetted if at all possible. But to me, this seems like a much more well-rounded team, even though they're going to have to rely on some of the younger talents like the Justin Lowe and Jeremiah McClellan on the outside. So yes, they do have a nice balance of being able to return some of their top pass rushers, some of those edge guys. But in terms of an actual position that I think they're going to have some concerns about, I'd say particularly in the cornerback room. Not so much because of the talent there, more because it's. I think last year it was a little bit more of a top heavy sort of thing, where the Jahir Muhammads of the world and the McLeans of the world, they were able to, a lot of those guys they could be number one corners on practically any program in the country. And granted, you are bringing in Naeem Afford too, who I think is going to be a really solid asset for him for years to come. They have been aggressive in the transfer portal, but at the same time too, I do think their primary target was, within fixing up that defensive line, adding a couple guys on the edge. I mean, Bear Alexander, anybody who's watched him at USC and Georgia knows that dude. He's the real deal, but he's had a couple injury concerns, and I think he needs a coach that can kind of spark that fire in him, because he has every God-given ability in the world to be a dog and to be somebody who can take over games. But I don't think we've seen that quite translate yet into something that can be sustainable. But as I look at this Oregon program, hey, you got a number of things going for you. You had a phenomenal 2024 season. You won your first Big Ten title. You have Dante Moore, who should be 100% their number one guy going into spring football. You brought in Bear Alexander in the transfer portal. You've solidified that front seven even more than you have before. Again, I think the cornerback room, I think shown that they could be exploited. I go back and particularly think of the Rose Bowl, and I also go back and think just in a couple moments within the college football playoff, where I think that a lot of those moments where those cornerbacks, when they were tested, teams found ways to exploit them. And if they want to move that forward, I do think that's something that they're going to have to touch upon. But otherwise, I would say this Oregon team, they have a lot of things going for them. Dan Lanning is the real deal. And, watch for Dante Moore this year, because I think he's going to ball out, and somebody that I think has a very similar skill set to Dylan Gabriel, and they're going to keep that momentum going.